The city never slept, not really. Its heartbeat pulsed through the streets in the form of flickering neon signs, honking horns, and the soft hum of ambition that never quite died, even after midnight. Somewhere above that restless rhythm, high, above the people who worked, loved, and struggled below, sat Sloane Whitfield, staring out the window of her penthouse office on the 48th floor of Whitfield Global's glass headquarters. She was worth more than most people could dream of. Forbes called her the Queen of Tech. Investors called her a genius, and the media called her untouchable. But tonight, none of those words meant a thing. Her company, the empire she had built from nothing, was days away from collapsing. Lawsuits, board revolts, a vicious competitor spreading lies that sent her stock price plummeting. The life she had crafted with blood, sweat, and sleepless nights was unraveling faster than she could patch it together. And to make things worse, her 7-year-old daughter, Ella, was asleep in the next room of her office suite, blissfully unaware that by morning, everything they had could be gone. Sloane pressed her palms into the cold glass, her reflection staring back at her. A woman who looked far more fragile than the world ever saw. Her phone buzzed again. It was another email from the board, urging her to step down. For the sake of the company, they said. But they didn't know. They didn't know how hard she had fought to get here, how many doors had slammed in her face, how many nights she'd eaten cold ramen at her desk while designing the software that made Whitfield global. What it was today. Walking away now wasn't an option. Not after everything. But even Sloane had to admit she was running out of options. 3 blocks away, under the buzzing fluorescent lights of a 24-hour diner, another life was playing out. Marcus Carter stirred a cup of cheap black coffee with a cracked plastic spoon, his eyes fixed on the rain streaking down the window. He had been sitting at that same booth every night for 2 months. Partly because the waitress didn't chase him out when his money ran low, and partly because the diner's free Wi-Fi was the closest thing he had to an office. Once upon a time, Marcus had a corner office of his own. He had a job, a good one, as a software engineer at one of the city's top firms. But layoffs had come fast and ruthless during the recession, and one bad turn followed another. His savings disappeared, his apartment was gone, and eventually, so was his hope. Now, his workspace was a chipped Formica table, his equipment, a second-hand laptop with a cracked screen, and his home, a park bench on 8th Street. But still, every night Marcus coded. It was the one thing he knew, the one thing that kept his mind from drowning in everything he'd lost. He built apps no one saw, wrote scripts no one used, and dreamed dreams that seemed to shrink further away with every sunrise. That night, fate, or something like it, set both their paths on a collision course. Sloane's phone rang, and the name flashing on the screen made her heart pound. Gareth Stein. It read, her fiercest competitor, the man who had been circling Whitfield Global like a vulture. When she answered, his voice was calm, almost smug. "Sloane, I'll make this simple," he said. "Resign, publicly, by Friday, or I'll release the rest of the data. And trust me, after that, no one will touch you or your company." She hung up before he could say more. Her hands shook. The data he threatened to release was an internal prototype, a revolutionary project that could change the industry forever. If it leaked before launch, it would destroy her company. She needed a solution, and she needed it fast. But her lead engineers had failed. They said it was impossible to secure the system in time. Impossible. But Sloane had never believed in impossible. At 2 a.m., driven by desperation, she slipped into a coffee shop near the edge of downtown, a place she hadn't visited since her early startup days. Back then, she'd sit in that very booth for hours, sketching ideas on napkins and coding into the night. Now it was almost empty, save for a few students and one man hunched over a battered laptop, typing furiously with headphones on. She noticed him because of his code. She couldn't help but glance at his screen as she passed, and what she saw stopped her cold. It wasn't the messy, amateur stuff she was used to seeing from wannabe developers. It was elegant, fast, secure, the kind of back-end architecture only someone truly gifted could write. Whoever he was brilliant. "Excuse me," she said cautiously. Marcus looked up, startled. He wasn't used to being spoken to, especially not by women in tailored coats and $1,000 heels. "Oh, yeah, are you a developer?" she asked. He gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. Once. Would you be interested in looking at a problem I'm trying to solve? I can pay you, lady," he said, shaking his head. "You don't want me. I'm just a guy trying to get by." But Sloane wasn't leaving. "I think I do," she said firmly. "And I think you're exactly who I need." There was something in her tone, a mix of desperation and respect, that made Marcus pause. People like her never spoke to people like him. They didn't ask for help. They didn't see potential in men with calloused hands and worn-out shoes. And yet, here she was. 10 minutes later, she was showing him the encrypted file on her laptop. 15 minutes after that, he was staring at it in disbelief. "Who wrote this?" he asked. "I did," she replied. 2 years ago." His eyes widened. "You're Sloane Whitfield. And you're the only person I've seen all week who might actually be able to fix it." Marcus stared at the code again. It was complex, beautiful, even, but deeply flawed. And yet, as his mind worked through it, a solution began to form. "It's not impossible," he murmured. "It's hard, but not impossible." For the first time in weeks, Sloane allowed herself to hope. The deal they made that night was simple. Sloane would pay Marcus a consulting fee, far more than he had seen in years, if he could fix the vulnerability in her prototype before the deadline. But more than money, she offered something else, a chance to rebuild the life he had lost. He hesitated for a long time before agreeing, but when he did, it wasn't for the paycheck. It was because of the look in her eyes. A look that told him she was clinging to this solution like a lifeline. They started working the next morning. Sloane had her team set up a private workspace in one of the company's unused labs. It wasn't glamorous, just a few terminals, a whiteboard covered in scribbles, and enough coffee to fuel an army. But it was theirs. Marcus arrived early, laptop under his arm, wearing the same faded jacket he'd worn the night before. The receptionist had looked at him like he didn't belong. Maybe once, that would have made him leave. But not this time. He had a mission now. Sloane was already there when he walked in, her blazer tossed over a chair, hair pulled into a messy bun. She wasn't the powerful CEO the world saw in press conferences. She was just a mother trying desperately to save everything she'd built, and to protect the future of the little girl who occasionally peeked her head into the lab with a curious smile. "Ready?" she asked. Marcus cracked his knuckles. "Let's do this." What followed were some of the most grueling days of Marcus's life. The system's vulnerabilities weren't simple coding errors. They were deeply embedded flaws that would take more than a patch to solve. He rewrote thousands of lines, built new encryption layers from scratch, and tore apart sections of the code that even Sloane had forgotten she'd written. They worked side by side for hours on end. Two people from opposite worlds united by a single purpose. And somewhere in the midst of sleepless nights and cold takeout meals, they began to talk. Really talk. She learned about the job he'd lost. A promising career at a tech startup that had folded without warning. About the eviction notice that came 2 weeks later. About the girlfriend who couldn't handle the downward spiral and left. About the months of rejection letters and job interviews that never turned into offers. And about the moment he'd stopped seeing himself as a man with a future and started seeing himself as just another statistic. He learned about her too. About the investors who had doubted her from day one. About the sexism she'd faced breaking into an industry that had never wanted her there. About the husband who had walked out when the pressure became too much. About the nights she'd rocked her daughter to sleep with one hand and typed code with the other, because quitting had never been an option. By the third day, they weren't just solving a technical problem. They were building something much deeper: trust. But while they worked, Gareth Stein was tightening the noose. He launched a smear campaign in the press, leaking false reports about Whitfield Global's finances. Anonymous posts began appearing on tech forums accusing Sloan of fraud. One particularly damaging article claimed she had stolen code, the same prototype Marcus was now trying to save. Investors panicked. Stocks plunged. The board called another emergency meeting. "They're going to vote you out," warned Lisa Chen, Sloan's CFO and closest friend. "They think the company is better off without you." The Sloan's jaw tightened. They might be right. Marcus overheard the conversation from the hallway. That night, he found her alone in the lab, staring at the city lights. "You're not thinking of quitting, are you?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe Gareth wins. Maybe I walk away and start over?" "Start over," he said, incredulous. "You built $1 billion company from scratch. You're raising a daughter on your own. And you're about to launch tech that could change the industry. You don't start over, you finish." She laughed softly. "Easy for you to say." "Not really," Marcus replied. "I gave up once. And I've regretted it every single day since. Don't make the same mistake." Her eyes softened. "You really believe we can pull this off?" "I wouldn't still be here if I didn't." By the 5th day, they had something that almost worked. The system was stronger, faster, but one critical flaw remained. A single vulnerability in the encryption core that could be exploited if Gareth's team had access to the original source code. Sloan was furious with herself for missing it. Marcus, however, saw an opportunity. "What if," he said, pacing the room, "we give him access?" She stared at him. "Are you insane? Not real access. A trap. We leak a fake version of the source code. One that looks authentic but has a traceable fingerprint. If Gareth tries to use it, we'll have legal proof of theft." It was risky. If it failed, Gareth could ruin them before they even launched. But if it worked, it would end his campaign once and for all. They moved forward with the plan. The leak hit the dark web 3 days later. Within 48 hours, an anonymous developer uploaded a suspiciously similar project to an obscure repository. One that contained Marcus's hidden fingerprint. It was all the proof they needed. Sloan's legal team moved quickly, filing an injunction and a lawsuit. Within hours, Gareth's offices were raided, his servers seized, and his stock price tanked. The board that had been ready to oust Sloan suddenly rallied behind her. And as the company stabilized, investors flooded back in. But even as victory loomed, Sloan knew the battle wasn't over. The prototype still had to launch, and it had to work flawlessly. The future of Whitfield Global, and everything she'd fought for, depended on it. On the eve of the launch, she found Marcus asleep at his desk, his laptop still glowing with lines of code. She draped a blanket over his shoulders and stood there for a long moment, watching him. This man, the one the world had written off, the one society had overlooked, had saved her company. But more than that, he had reminded her of something she'd forgotten. That genius doesn't always wear a suit, and potential doesn't vanish just because life knocks you down. The next morning, the city woke to headlines that no one saw coming. Whitfield Global to launch revolutionary new security platform. Reporters crowded the lobby. Cameras flashed. Investors cheered. And when Sloan walked onto the stage to deliver her keynote, Marcus was right there in the front row, in a borrowed blazer and a freshly ironed shirt, but still very much himself. She began her speech with a story, not about profits or technology, but about second chances. About how sometimes the person you least expect becomes the one who changes everything. The audience listened in silence, many unaware that the man she was talking about was sitting just a few feet away. And as she spoke, Marcus felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years: pride. The launch day was a blur of lights, applause, and press cameras, but the real story was unfolding behind the scenes. Marcus stood backstage, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his borrowed blazer, listening to Sloane's speech echo through the auditorium. Every word she spoke, about resilience, redemption, and untapped potential, felt like it was about him, even though she never once said his name. When the presentation ended, the prototype went live. The system, now stronger, faster, and more secure than ever, began to roll out to clients across the globe. The launch was a resounding success. Stock prices surged overnight. Whitfield Global's name dominated every headline. Analysts who had predicted the company's collapse were suddenly calling it the comeback story of the decade. And Sloan, who had been on the verge of being ousted just weeks earlier, was now hailed as a visionary. But for Marcus, none of that mattered as much as the moment Sloan walked off the stage, found him waiting in the wings, and simply said, "We did it." It was two small words, but they hit him harder than any paycheck or public recognition ever could. Over the next few weeks, Marcus's life began to change in ways he hadn't thought possible. Sloan offered him a permanent position as a lead engineer, complete with benefits and a salary that would have once seemed like a fantasy. At first, he hesitated. Part of him still felt like an outsider, like a fraud who didn't belong in a world of glass offices and board meetings. But Sloan reminded him that he wasn't there out of charity. He was there because he had earned it. "You saved this company," she told him one afternoon as they walked through the office. "You saved me. I don't want you to work for me, Marcus. I want you to work with me." And so, he accepted. The transition wasn't easy. Marcus struggled to adjust to office life again. The suits, the jargon, the endless meetings. He often felt out of place surrounded by people with degrees from prestigious universities and resumes full of big, name companies. There were whispers behind his back, people wondering why the CEO had hired some homeless guy to lead a critical department. But Marcus ignored them. He'd faced worse than whispers. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. People started to respect him. Not because of where he came from, but because of what he could do. His team quickly realized that his unconventional background gave him an edge. He approached problems differently, thought outside the box, and wasn't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom. In a company that had grown too comfortable with the way things are done, Marcus became the spark of innovation they didn't know they needed. Meanwhile, Sloan found herself changing too. For the first time in years, she wasn't just running a company. She was building a vision. The experience with Marcus had forced her to re-examine everything's how Whitfield Global operated, how it hired, how it treated people. She launched new initiatives aimed at hiring talent from overlooked communities, creating apprenticeship programs for people without traditional degrees, and partnering with nonprofits that supported homeless job seekers. And when critics accused her of using Marcus as a token success story, she didn't bother defending herself. The results spoke for themselves. But not everyone was happy with the new direction. Some board members pushed back, arguing that the company was straying too far from its core mission. Investors grumbled about the increased spending on social programs, and Gareth Stein, now under investigation but still determined to destroy Sloan, began spreading new rumors, this time targeting Marcus directly. One morning, Marcus walked into the office to find his inbox flooded with hateful messages. A smear article had gone viral, revealing his past in humiliating detail, his eviction records, his arrest for loitering, even a photo of him sleeping on a park bench. The comments were vicious. "He's a fraud. He doesn't deserve that job. Only got hired because he's a PR stunt." Marcus felt the weight of every word. Old doubts crept back in, the same ones that had haunted him during those long, cold nights on the street. Maybe they were right. Maybe he didn't belong here after all. That night, he packed his things and prepared to walk away. But Sloan stopped him at the elevator. "Going somewhere?" she asked quietly. "I don't belong here," he muttered. "You know it. They know it. I'm just the charity case they can't wait to get rid of." She stepped closer, her voice firm. "Do you know why I hired you, Marcus? Not because I felt sorry for you. Not because I needed good press. Because you're the best person for the job. Because when everyone else said it was impossible, you proved them wrong. And because this company, my company, is better with you in it." "But the things they're saying, let them talk," she interrupted. "They talked about me too. Said a woman could never run a tech company. Said I didn't belong in the boardroom. If I'd listened, I'd still be typing code in my apartment instead of standing here." Marcus looked at her, unsure what to say. "You told me once that you regretted giving up," she continued. "Don't make that mistake twice." He stared at the elevator for a long moment before finally letting his bag drop to the floor. The next day, he was back at work. But this time, he wasn't hiding from his past. He was owning it. In a company-wide meeting, Marcus stood on stage and told his story publicly for the first time. He talked about losing everything, about sleeping on the streets, about how society had written him off as a failure. And then he talked about second chances, about how one act of trust had changed everything. The room was silent when he finished, and then, slowly, people began to clap. It started with Sloan, then his team, then the entire room. Even the board members who had doubted him rose to their feet. The smear campaign backfired. Instead of undermining Marcus's credibility, it made him a symbol of resilience, a living reminder that talent and potential don't disappear just because someone hits rock bottom. From that day on, things changed. He was no longer the homeless guy Sloan hired. He was Marcus Carter, Director of Systems Innovation, and one of the most respected voices in the company. But even as his professional life soared, something deeper was happening between him and Sloan. Their late nights working together turned into dinners. Dinners turned into long conversations about everything from philosophy to parenting. And those conversations became something neither of them had planned for. Something they both tried to ignore, but couldn't. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was connection. It was something more. By the time autumn painted the city in gold and crimson, the connection between Sloan and Marcus had grown into something neither could deny. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't reckless. It was slow, deliberate, built on late night talks over cold takeout, quiet walks after board meetings, and shared glances that lasted a little too long. They both knew the risks. Office gossip, media scrutiny, shareholder backlash. But they also knew something else: they made each other better. For Sloan, Marcus had become more than a colleague or even a savior. He was her anchor. In a world where people smiled to her face and plotted behind her back, He was the one person who saw her not as a billionaire or a CEO, but as a human being, flawed, scared, and trying her best. For Marcus, Sloane wasn't a charity case or a symbol of corporate greed. She was a woman who had fought every inch of the way, who carried the weight of an empire and still tucked her daughter into bed at night. They balanced each other. Her sharpness softened his edges, and his grounded wisdom calmed her storms. But just as life seemed to be settling into something stable, another storm was brewing, one far more personal than any boardroom battle. One evening, Sloane invited Marcus to dinner at her home, a sprawling modern penthouse that overlooked the city skyline. Ella, her daughter, was there too, shy at first but quickly drawn to Marcus's warmth. They played a card game after dinner, and for the first time in years, Sloane felt something she hadn't felt since her marriage fell apart home. It terrified her. After Ella went to bed, they stood on the balcony, watching the city lights. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought I'd trust someone again, not after what happened with David." "Yar, Marcus asked gently. She nodded. "He walked out when things got hard. Said I was too ambitious, too focused on the company. He didn't want to play second to my career." Marcus turned to her. "You deserve someone who's not intimidated by your strength." She smiled faintly. "And you deserve someone who sees yours." For a moment, the air between them changed. Words gave way to silence, not awkward, but electric. And then, without overthinking it, Sloane closed the distance and kissed him. It was hesitant at first, then certain, a collision of two people who had spent too long building walls around their hearts. It should have been perfect. But the world, as they were about to learn, wasn't ready to let them be happy so easily. News of their relationship leaked a few weeks later. A paparazzi photo of them holding hands outside a restaurant went viral. Headlines exploded. CEO Sloane Whitfield dating former homeless man. The internet predictably had opinions. Some called it inspiring. Others called it scandalous. A few accused Marcus of hoosing her. Even more accused Sloane of playing savior. The board demanded answers. "This isn't a fairy tale." Sloane, one member, snapped during an emergency meeting. "It's a liability." She stared him down. "It's my life. Your personal choices affect this company. Then, maybe this company needs to remember that it's run by a person, not a machine," she shot back. But the pressure was relentless. Reporters camped outside her office. Investors called for leadership changes. Anonymous threats appeared online. And through it all, Marcus began to question whether his presence was helping her or hurting her. One night, after another brutal round of media attacks, he showed up at her apartment with a heavy look in his eyes. "I think I should step away," he said quietly. "Step away from what?" she asked. "From the company. From this," he gestured between them. "You're losing investors. Board members are threatening lawsuits. And it's because of me. You've worked your whole life for this. I can't be the reason you lose it." Sloane's chest tightened. "Marcus, don't you dare blame yourself for their prejudice." "It's not just them," he said. "It's me too. Every time I walk into a room, I see the looks. I hear the whispers. I thought I was strong enough to ignore them, but maybe I'm not." She stepped closer. "You are strong enough. And I don't care what they say. I care about you." He shook his head. "This isn't about love, Sloane. It's about reality. And reality is, people like me don't end up with people like you." Her voice trembled. "People like you. Marcus, you're the reason I'm still standing. You're the reason this company exists. And you're the reason I believe in second chances." But he didn't answer. He just looked at her one last time, whispered, "I'm sorry," and walked out the door. The days that followed were some of the hardest Sloane had ever endured. The office felt colder. The city skyline she once loved looked emptier. And Ella, perceptive as ever, asked one night, "Mommy, why doesn't Marcus come around anymore?" Sloane's heart broke as she answered, "Sometimes, people we care about need time to find their way back." Meanwhile, Marcus tried to disappear. He quit his job, cashed his final paycheck, and moved into a small apartment far from the city center. He avoided social media, ignored calls, and drowned himself in freelance projects. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't silence the echo of her voice or the memory of the life they'd begun building together. And then, something unexpected happened. A video clip of his company speech, the one where he told his story, went viral. Millions watched. News anchors replayed it on primetime. Commentators praised his honesty and courage. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. He wasn't just the homeless man dating a billionaire. He was a symbol, a living testament to resilience, redemption, and the power of second chances. Emails poured in from people he'd never met. Former engineers who had lost their jobs. Students who had dropped out of college. Single parents struggling to make ends meet. All of them said the same thing: "Your story gave me hope." It was then Marcus realized something running away hadn't made the noise stop. It had only made him smaller. And if there was one thing Sloane had taught him, it was that you don't shrink to fit the world's expectations. You rise above them. So, one rainy Thursday night, Marcus stood outside her penthouse building, drenched but determined. When Sloane opened the door, her eyes widened in shock. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything. I don't care what they say. I don't care about the headlines. I care about you. And I'm done running." Tears filled her eyes as she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. For a long time, they stood there in silence, holding on as if letting go would mean losing everything all over again. "I don't know what's going to happen," she whispered. "Neither do I," he replied. "But I know we'll face it together." The reunion marked the start of a new chapter. Not the fairy tale ending they might have once imagined, but something real, grounded, and stronger than anything they'd known before. Sloane and Marcus knew the road ahead would still be full of challenges. The media didn't suddenly grow kinder. The board didn't magically stop questioning her decisions. And society didn't instantly abandon its prejudices. But they also knew something else together. They could weather any storm. Their decision to face the world side by side sent a message far beyond their own lives. When Sloane returned to the boardroom with Marcus at her side, she didn't apologize. Instead, she presented a bold new vision for Whitfield Global, one rooted in inclusion, opportunity, and social impact. The company would launch a new initiative, a tech incubator, that trained and hired underprivileged individuals, including those who had experienced homelessness, incarceration, or systemic bias. It was ambitious, risky, and controversial. Some investors threatened to pull out. Others called it a distraction. But Sloane didn't waver. "This company was built to solve problems," she told them. "And the greatest problem in tech isn't competition. It's exclusion. It's ignoring talent because it doesn't come packaged the way we expect. Marcus taught me that, and I won't run a company that turns its back on people like him." The vote was tense, but the motion passed. Within months, the incubator, named Second Origin, launched. Applications poured in from across the country. People who had been told they weren't good enough, weren't smart enough, or didn't fit. Marcus took the lead in designing the training program, mentoring participants himself and using his own story as proof that brilliance doesn't always wear a suit or come with a degree. The media that had once mocked them now ran glowing profiles about the couple who were changing the face of tech. But even amid their growing success, life didn't stop being complicated. There were still nights when Sloan lay awake, worrying about the company's future. There were still days when Marcus wrestled with imposter syndrome. And there were still whispers. The kind that never quite go away. Yet with every obstacle, they grew stronger. They learned to lean on each other, to fight side by side instead of alone. One particularly tough day came a year later, when a major security flaw threatened to derail the company's newest product. Panic spread across the office. Investors were ready to pull funding. The press smelled blood, but instead of hiding behind press releases or deflecting blame, Sloan did something radical. She put Marcus in charge of the emergency response. Some employees balked. "He's not ready," one senior engineer argued. "This is too big," but Sloan didn't flinch. "He's the reason this company survived once," she said, "and he'll do it again." Marcus worked tirelessly for 72 hours straight, coordinating a team of engineers, patching vulnerabilities, and overseeing a new layer of encryption. The crisis was averted, and the product launched on time. And this time the headlines didn't question his competence. They praised his leadership. For Marcus, it was more than a professional victory. It was the moment he finally stopped seeing himself as the man who fell, and started seeing himself as the man who rose. Months turned into a year, and a year turned into 2. The company thrived under Sloan's leadership, expanding into new markets and doubling its workforce. Second Origin became one of the most respected training programs in the tech industry, producing dozens of successful careers. And as for Sloan and Marcus, their bond only deepened. They didn't rush into anything, not even marriage. But they built a life filled with shared dreams, Sunday breakfasts, and bedtime stories read to Ella, who had grown to adore the man who once lived on a park bench. One evening, after a long day of meetings and code reviews, Sloan and Marcus found themselves back on the balcony where they'd shared their first kiss. The city glittered beneath them, a mosaic of light and movement, a reminder of everything they had survived. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Sloan asked quietly. "All the time," Marcus admitted. "If I hadn't been at that diner, if you hadn't stopped to talk to me, if either of us had just walked away." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I guess that's the thing about second chances. They don't always come when you're ready, but they come when you need them most." He turned to face her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You saved me, Sloan." She shook her head. "No, we saved each other." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything they'd endured, everything they'd built, and everything that still lay ahead. They had started as two people from completely different worlds. A billionaire, on the brink of losing everything, and a homeless man who thought he had nothing left to give. But life had proven them both wrong. It wasn't the millions in her bank account that defined her, and it wasn't the mistakes of his past that defined him. It was what they had chosen to become. Not despite their scars, but because of them. As the night deepened and the city hummed below, Marcus pulled Sloan into his arms and kissed her. Not like a man grateful for a second chance, but like a man certain of the future he was building. And in that moment, everything, the rumors, the headlines, the whispers, faded into background noise. What mattered was this: they had found each other in a world that had written them off. They had built something stronger than money, more powerful than success, and far more enduring than any headline. They had built a story, one that would outlast every obstacle and inspire countless others to believe that redemption isn't just possible, it's worth fighting for. A year later, on the anniversary of the launch that saved Whitfield Global, Sloane stood on stage once again. The auditorium was packed with employees, investors, students from the Second Origin program, and even a few critics who had once called her reckless. This time, though, the speech wasn't about code or revenue. It was about people. "I once believed success was measured by how much you could build," she told them. "But I've learned that true success is measured by how much you can rebuild, in yourself, in others, and in the world around you. And sometimes, the people society overlooks are the very ones who change everything." The crowd erupted into applause, but Sloane's eyes sought out one face, Marcus, sitting in the front row, smiling up at her with the quiet pride of someone who knew exactly what it had taken to get here. This wasn't the ending either of them had expected. It wasn't even an ending at all. It was a beginning, one forged from broken pieces, second chances, and the unshakable belief that no matter how far you fall, it's never too late to rise again.